Hello, everybody, and welcome to our live stream on the shorter GRE versus the GMAT Focus edition. Super exciting stuff. I can't wait to get into it and help you all figure out how to make sense of these new announcements. But before we get started, can you let me know in the chat, can you see me? Can you hear me? Can you see my slideshow? Let me know, and then we'll go ahead and get started. Oh, looks like we're good. Looks like maybe I was muted for 1 second there, but I think we're all right. Okay, perfect. Welcome to our live stream, the shorter GRE versus the GMAT Focus Edition. We're going to be talking about the differences between these two exams, as well as which one you should take. All right, I'm going to introduce myself in just a second, but first let's talk a little bit about context. Okay, so context here. What is the information that we're working with? So back in March, GMAT, those are the makers of the GMAT, announced the release of a shorter edition of the GMAT called the GMAT Focus. This is kind of a funny announcement. It leaked a little bit, and so folks were kind of scrambling, trying to figure out the information before GMAT officially announced it. And this has been kind of a slow roll of information since. Now, it seems pretty clear that this shorter version of the test is a reaction to changes in the test prep and admissions landscape. Right, we have the rise of test optional and test blind. We also have an important Supreme Court decision coming down later this year, and so things are changing. And as a result, some test providers have been reacting in a way that seems to indicate that they really want people to take the test. So the release of the GMAT Focus, this exam is shorter, it's a little bit more friendly, and it seems to be angled toward encouraging students to take the test, lowering the barrier to entry to take that test, and then potentially also for schools, making that a less onerous requirement. So it says, hey, students, even if you don't have to take the test, please do. But also schools, maybe you should encourage students to take the test because it's not as hard to take it as it used to be. So that's all speculation, but that is the new version of the GMAT. And so that information has been rolling out since. We'll talk more about the timeline later. And if you're curious specifically about the differences between the current GMAT and the GMAT Focus, you can check out our YouTube channel. I did a live stream on the difference between the current GMAT and the GMAT Focus. We're going to talk about some of that today, but we are going to be focusing on the newer version. So if you want more context, check out that live stream recording. Now, so that happened in March. Now, just last week, ETS, those are the makers of the GRE, said, hey, us too, right? We have a shorter version of our test as well. It doesn't really have a name. We're just kind of calling it the shorter GRE or the new GRE, but that was announced just last week. And it's got kind of a different timeline than the GMAT. We'll talk about that in a little bit as well. Now, a lot of folks are saying this is a reaction to the GMAT Focus, right? They're saying, hey, if they're going shorter, so are we. So we're trying to stay competitive in the space. And that may be true, or it may be that they were also doing this in parallel with GMAT, again, in reaction to this broader trend in the test prep industry, who can say, or in the testing industry, who can say. But ETS is pretty pointedly comparing their shorter GRE to the GMAT Focus. So it's a little spicy in the testing space right now. Now, all of this is well and good, but it does make for a very interesting situation for you all, right? For folks who are potentially taking either one of these tests, because already you're faced with the decision, right? If you're applying to an MBA program, you have a decision between taking the GMAT and the GRE. Now that decision is more complicated because you have these new versions of the exams and maybe we don't know what to do with them, right? So complicated stuff for you guys. So what we're going to talk about today is hopefully some stuff that's going to make that decision easier. So if you are choosing between the GMAT Focus and the shorter GRE. We're going to talk through what those differences are and how you can make an educated decision for you. So our goals for today, we're going to review the key differences between the shorter GRE and the GMAT Focus Edition across structure, content, scoring, and timeline. And like I mentioned, I did specifically a live stream on the current GMAT versus the Focus Edition. Focus edition of the GMAT that is on our Magoosh GRE YouTube channel if you want to check that out. I also did a live stream last week on the shorter GRE versus the current GRE. That's on our Magoosh GRE YouTube channel. You can check that out. But today we're going to focus on the new versions for both exams and comparing them to each other. Got some new information today. We'll cover some of the stuff that we've covered before, but we have some new stuff as well. So we're going to talk about the key differences between them. And then we're going to talk about, okay, based on these differences, as well as some other factors, how you can decide which test is right for you. Okay, before we jump in, I'm going to introduce myself. Hi, my name is Erika. You might know me. I'm a Senior Product Manager here at Magoosh. I've worked on our GRE product. I've worked on our GMAT product. I'm currently working quite a bit on our MBA admissions product. I have over 1 million views on YouTube. You may have seen me here before. I've got 99th percentile scores on the GRE and the GMAT. Current versions, have not taken the new test yet because they're not available, but hoping to. And I have years of test prep experience writing content, teaching content. I live in Portland, Oregon with my husband and my 2 cats, and you can see them right there, Roz and Mel. They're very cute. The door is closed, so they cannot disturb us during this live stream. All right. One other thing that I wanted to let you guys know, our Magoosh GRE and GMAT plans are on sale through the 12th. This is our monthly sale. We have 20% off our premium test prep plans for both GRE and GMAT, as well as 25% off our premium plus admissions bundles. So that's GRE plus grad admissions and GMAT plus MBA admissions. This is a really good deal. I just want to shout that out. I really recommend taking advantage. You can head over to magoosh.com to check out that sale. But again, really good deal on sale through the 12th. Highly recommend. And we'll talk about how you can use Magoosh to prep for either the current versions or the new versions of either of these tests. All right, jumping in, we're going to start with the key differences, and there are quite a few between the shorter GRE and the GMAT Focus. So we'll start by talking about the differences in structure. So we'll start by walking through the GMAT Focus structure. We'll start with the weird one. So the new section on the GMAT Focus, note that I'm putting this in quotes because it's not that new, but the newly named section on the GMAT Focus is data insights. And we'll talk about what content is in that section in a little bit. But data insights is the new section. And data insights is going to be 20 questions focused on data analysis type topics in 45 minutes. All right, so 20 questions in 45 minutes. That means you got a little bit more than a little bit more than 2 minutes per question. All right, so that's data insights. Then we have, okay, getting back into more normal territory here, we've got quant, right? That's the math section. And that's going to be 21 questions in 45 minutes. So very similar to data insights, slightly more questions, same amount of time. So that means, again, slightly less time per question. And then we have verbal, again, a more standard section, and that's going to be 23 questions in 45 minutes. So again, same time for each of those sections, but even more questions in verbal. So again, slightly less time per question in verbal. All right, so 3 equally length sections, but with an increasing number of questions in each one. And then we also have a 10-minute break. So note here, this is not as many sections as the current GMAT used to have. It used to have some other sections, but it's just these 3 equally length sections at this point. There's also a 10-minute break that is optional. You don't have to take it, but it is there. That's nice. You get a little reprieve. And then an important thing to note about the GMAT Focus is that it is question adaptive. This is something that the current GMAT is as well. So question adaptive means, if you haven't heard this before, I've got a lot of videos on this on the GMAT YouTube channel, but the short version is it takes your performance on the question that you're on, and it uses that to inform the difficulty of the upcoming questions. So for each question, they're going to assess, hey, did you get this right or wrong? And what difficulty was that question. And then based on that, they're either going to move you to a harder level or an easier level. And they're going to do that until they land on your difficulty, which is where you're missing about half of the questions. And that's what's going to inform your score. All right. So question adaptive means each question impacts the following questions. Now, an interesting thing that the GMAT Focus has done that the current version of the GMAT does not do. So current version of the GMAT, you have to answer each question as you get to it, right? You have to do it, and then you never get to see that question again. You don't get to return to it. You don't get to skip a question and come back. That's not a thing on the current GMAT. On the GMAT Focus, we have an interesting thing. So they said, hey, that students don't like that. So what we're going to do is we're going to allow you to change up to 3 answers per section. So that means that as you go through, right, we're going to answer the questions, but you can come back at the end of the section. So at the end of data insights, the end of quant, the end of verbal, and you can change up to 3 answers per section. You cannot change more, just 3, which is interesting. All right. This is not something that I've really seen with any other exam. So it potentially lowers the barrier to entry on GMAT, but it also adds a new level of complexity. So we'll talk about that in a little bit. But that's the question adaptivity and the structure overall on the GMAT Focus. Let's talk shorter GRE. Okay, shorter GRE structure starts with analytical writing. One thing that I didn't really mention as we were going through GMAT Focus is that, again, we have fewer sections, but the section that's missing is AWA, right? That was the essay section. It's gone. It's just been completely eliminated from the GMAT Focus, which is kind of cool, right? It was already a lesser section. It's one that wasn't included in the total score. It's one that not a lot of students cared about and not a lot of admissions committees really cared about. The shorter GRE retains the section. We still have an essay section, analytical writing. Now, we'll talk more about what's in it, but it used to be 2 questions and now it's only 1. So it's shorter, but it's still there. That's an interesting thing. Shorter GRE has quant, just like GMAT. But we'll note here that quant is 27 questions in 47 minutes. So that's more questions with not a lot more time. So we have less time per question. Another interesting thing here is that on GMAT Focus, the 21 questions in 45 minutes, that's 1 section, right? You do it from front to back. Whereas on the shorter GRE, this is broken into 2 sections. Now, something that's kind of interesting, and check back on this, is that we don't know exactly how those 27 questions in 47 minutes will be divided up between those 2 sections. That's still being revealed by ETS. We'll tell you when we know exactly how that's going to work, but we do know that it will be divided up into 2 different sections. So you'll do the 1 section, you'll be done, all right? You can't go back to that section, and then you'll have another section. And we'll talk more about what that means in a second. So that's quant, less time per question, broken up into 2 sections. We also have verbal, again, standard section or domain type. And again, that's going to be 27 questions, so same question number, but fewer minutes, 41 minutes. And that is, again, going to be divided up into 2 sections. Again, don't know how exactly it'll be divided into 2, but we know that it will be. So again, less time per question, right? We've got, in fact, if we compare to GMAT Focus, we've got more questions and fewer minutes. So pretty tight timing on the verbal for GRE, for shorter GRE. And we have, again, broken up into 2 shorter sections. Now, the shorter GRE does not have a break, all right? No breaks, which makes the test shorter, and there is less content, so that's fair, but there isn't a break. So that means you're gonna have to really be taking advantage of those screens between each section to catch your breath and mentally prepare yourself for the next section, but there is no 10-minute break. And then the shorter GRE is section adaptive, just like the current GRE. All right, so what does that mean? Well, instead of a question deciding the difficulty of the upcoming questions, we have the first quant section deciding the difficulty of the second quant section, and the first verbal section deciding the difficulty of the second verbal section. So if you get X number of questions right on the first quant section, you'll get either the hard medium, or easy quant second section. Now, it's always good to get the harder one, even if you're going to get fewer questions right. Getting the harder one means better things for your score. But then again, it's number of questions, right, that informs that score. So that's kind of an interesting thing. So it is section adaptive. Now, what does that mean for you, right, other than how it's scored? Well, because individual questions aren't informing the difficulty of later questions, you can change them all you want, right? On GMAT Focus, if you could change your questions willy-nilly, they wouldn't be able to do that section or that question adaptivity, right? Because you could potentially guess on all the questions, get really easy stuff, go back and change them, and then they're all right, and then what's your score, right? It doesn't make sense. Whereas on shorter GRE, because that isn't happening, right? At the end of each section, you can change unlimited answers. Now, once you say, okay, I'm done with the section or time runs out, you can't go back. You can't change it. But within the section, you can do all the skipping, all of the re-changing your answers that you want. So that's maybe a little bit more standard in terms of strategy. So a lot of differences. One other thing that I didn't mention on this slide, but I want to mention live, is that on the GMAT Focus, you have the ability to choose your section order. So you can start with whatever section you want. So if you really struggle with quant, right, that's something where maybe you struggle when you're tired, you can start with quant. And I usually advise that for a lot of students. On the shorter GRE, you don't get to. They start with analytical writing, always. And then the other sections are random order. And I'm like 95% sure that is retained for the shorter GRE. That's the way the current GRE is as well. And section choice is also a thing, or section order choice is also a thing on the current GMAT. So that's a thing as well to consider, is that for GMAT Focus, you can kind of cater the experience to you. Whereas on the shorter GRE, you're always starting with the section that isn't as important. So that's one thing that's worth noting. All right, so that's a lot of information. Let's distill. Let's figure out takeaways. What does that mean for you? All right, so if you were paying attention, adding up those numbers as we went, you would have noticed that the shorter GRE is shorter than the GMAT Focus, and ETS really wants you to know that. It is shorter, but not by that much. So the shorter GRE is 1 hour and 58 minutes, whereas the GMAT Focus is 2 hours and 15 minutes. And I'll note that 2 hours 15 does not include that 10-minute break. So if you add in the 10-minute break, it's 2 hours 25 minutes, which, okay, we're starting to see maybe a little bit longer, right? So the shorter GRE is shorter. That's nice, maybe for stamina, but it's not that much shorter. The shorter GRE has shorter sections, but more of them. And this was true with the current versions as well, right? So on the GMAT, you take quant and then you're done. You take verbal and then you're done, right? Whereas on the shorter GRE, you take quant and then later you're gonna get more quant. You take verbal and then later you're gonna get more verbal, right? So shorter GRE, there's less stamina within a section, but you have to do more sections. So pros and cons. The shorter GRE has less time per question. Oh, and I'm going to pause for a second to say, I'm seeing some questions in the chat. Thank you. Great questions. We're going to talk about those later. So that's going to come up later in there. I'm also going to have a Q&A section at the end of the slideshow. So if you have questions, I'll come back through and answer those, and you can ask them again later on. Some really good questions in here. Again, I'm going to address all of these in the slideshow, and if I don't, I'll get to them at the Q&A at the end. But coming back here, shorter GRE has less time per question, and that is true across both quant and verbal, right? So what does that mean? So it means that you're a little more pressed for time. Now, of course, you do have the advantage of being able to skip questions and come back, which you don't on the GMAT, but for each individual questions, you have less time. Now, I don't know if I would say that GRE questions tend to be a little bit simpler, a little bit less complex than GMAT questions. I might say that, true for the current version as well as for the newer versions, but you certainly do have to do them faster, even if they are maybe slightly less complex. The shorter GRE has a more standard time management strategy. So this is probably the biggest thing, and it's true again for the current versions as well as for these newer versions. The question adaptivity really kind of throws a wrench into things. So for the shorter GRE, and come back to hard questions. And that's again standard if you took like the SAT or the ACT or like really any other test in your educational career. That's pretty much what you do, right? If you run into a hard question, rather than spending a ton of time agonizing over it and racking your brain, and maybe then not having enough time for easier questions you could get right later, you just say, nope, not going to bother. I'm going to come back later, maybe with fresh eyes, or I can make a guess, right? And that's a standard time management strategy. Whereas on the GMAT, you can't do that. Now, the GMAT Focus has made things even more complicated because on the current version of the GMAT, you just know you have to move on and you're never going to be able to come back, right? But with the GMAT Focus, you might be able to come back. Maybe. It depends on how many questions and which ones you decide to come back to. So it actually adds kind of a new and complicated time management element here. So that's worth bearing in mind. So the shorter GRE is shorter, but it has and it has maybe a more standard time management strategy. GMAT Focus time management is a little bit nasty because you have to make kind of calculated decisions about when to guess, knowing that maybe you can come back. So structurally, that's what's going on between the GMAT Focus and the shorter GRE. So I would say here, shorter GRE is perhaps simpler structurally. But let's talk about content. All right, key differences in content. GMAT Focus content, let's run down. So data insights. All right, let's start again with the weird one. So data insights has varied question types. This is the weird section. They kind of took all the weird questions, the oddball ones, and shoved them into data insights. So if you've studied it all for the current version of the GMAT, you know data sufficiency, right? And that currently lives in the quant section. It does not anymore. Now it lives in data insights. That's a weird question type. And it's a hard question type. It's kind of unique to the GMAT. It is now in data insights. And then if you studied again at all for integrated reasoning, you know that there's 4 different kind of nasty, strangely formatted question types. Those are all in data insights now. So data insights is basically integrated reasoning content plus data sufficiency. That's all blended together in data insights. So we've got a variety of question types in here. And these question types cover a variety of topics, right? So just like integrated reasoning, tested math, verbal reasoning, all kind of blended into data analysis. That's the same thing for data insights. We just added in data sufficiency, which is more math. So we've got, again, kind of an oddball section with data insights. I'd say it's potentially a little bit more math and quant-y than it is verbal-y, but it does have quite a few verbal reasoning skills, in particular, taking large amounts of information and distilling them quickly, or finding one piece of information from a broader set of information, or finding a trend from a broader set of information, which is more of a verbal reasoning skill. So that's data insights. It's a blend of things, and it's got a lot of question types. Quant, on the other hand, is extremely simple. So the current version of GMAT used to be, or currently still is, problem solving and data sufficiency. Since data sufficiency has moved to data insights, quant is just problem solving. So that's 5 answers, choose one. Standard, right? This is the normal multiple choice format. So only the one question type in quant, very straightforward. And these questions cover only 2 topics, arithmetic and algebra. Again, if you're familiar with the current version of the GMAT, you know that there is also geometry on the current version. That is gone for the GMAT Focus. No more geometry. Interesting. All right, so that's quant, pretty straightforward. Verbal is also pretty straightforward. We have reading comprehension, which is where we have a longer passage where we answer multiple questions to get main ideas, details, inferences, all that good stuff. And critical reasoning, where we have a paragraph argument where we answer one question, where we're strengthening the argument, weakening the argument by providing premises, or inferring to get a conclusion, or a couple other weirder things about the structure or whatever. So that's it. Again, if you're familiar with the current GMAT, you know that there used to be sentence correction, which is more focused on grammar and on meanings of sentences. That is, again, gone. And then, like we mentioned, AWA, the essay, also gone. So that's the content on GMAT Focus. Let's talk shorter GRE content. So again, first section is analytical writing. Like I mentioned, it used to be 2 questions, now it's 1. The only essay remaining is the analyze an issue essay. The analyze an argument essay, gone. So again, like I mentioned, there is no essay on GMAT Focus. There's still 1 essay on the shorter GRE. Moving on to quant, because there is no data insights on shorter GRE. But that same content is kind of baked into the quant section. So there are a variety of question types and data insights for GMAT Focus, and then there's just the 1 question type for quant. Quant on shorter GRE is a grab bag of question types, right? We've got basically problem solving or multiple choice, pick 1. We also have multiple choice, select 1 or more. We have numeric entry, where we can fill in a number. We have quantitative comparison, which is basically like the little cousin of data sufficiency. It's very similar, but maybe a little bit simpler in nature. And then we have data interpretation sets, which is kind of like data insights, maybe with a little bit less of the verbal reasoning element, but it focuses on data analysis. And again, it has all of those other question types, but baked into 1 data set. So there's a lot going on in quant in terms of question types. Similarly, there's a lot going on in terms of content types, right? So we have arithmetic and algebra, just like in quant. We have geometry, all right? So geometry is dead for GMAT Focus, but it is still on the shorter GRE. And then we have data analysis, which again is in data insights for GMAT Focus. It is here in quant for shorter GRE. So there's a lot going on in the quant section for shorter GRE. And then moving on to verbal, we have 3 question types. We have reading comprehension, and I'm going to pause here because reading comprehension on the shorter GRE includes what we would consider both reading comprehension and critical reasoning on the GMAT Focus. So reading comprehension on the GRE has those longer passages with multiple questions, as well as shorter paragraph argument type questions with those argument type questions. All right. Then on top of that, we have text completion and sentence equivalence, which most people think of as like the vocab question types. They're maybe a little bit more focused on sentence structure and sentence meaning, but they still do have that vocabulary element. Again, a lot of information. Let's distill. What are the takeaways? So there is no new content on either test. This is really important to note. And I think it says a lot about the point of this reformulation for each of these exams. This is not my first rodeo with tests changing. And usually when tests change, there's more fundamental changes to the content, right? And so there's a lot for students to learn. But that's not the case here. And that indicates that maybe there wasn't anything wrong with the existing exams. It's just that the fact that they're so long is unfriendly to students. So rather than, adding in new content types that are meant to be, better indicative of performance, we've just reduced content to get students to take it. So same content. I had a question in the chat. Is the difficulty level higher now? In terms of the content, no. The difficulty level should be the same. So if you are studying for either the current GRE or the shorter GRE, the content that you're studying that is retained across should be the same difficulty level. Now, the structure itself might provide some changes in difficulty level, but again, we'll talk about that a little bit more as it comes. But in terms of the content, no change in difficulty. Now that said, right, so there's no new content, but there is less content. Now, for both exams, they've eliminated content kind of across the board, right? Leaned out. But GMAT Focus has gone ahead and fully cut a bunch of content types, which makes it easier to study because you don't have to study as many things. Whereas the shorter GRE hasn't cut as many individual content types. They've just leaned down each one. So the shorter GRE, the only thing that they've cut is the analyze an argument essay, right? And they still have another essay. Whereas GMAT Focus has fully cut their writing component with AWA, they've fully cut geometry, which is kind of a hard thing to study for because there's a lot of rules, and they've fully cut sentence correction, which again, a lot of rules, a lot of grammar. So again, they've made it easier to study, and they've taken the test and really kind of focused on the questions that test critical thinking and eliminated the ones where there's a foundation of rules that you have to do the critical thinking on top of, right? So that's kind of an interesting thing. So maybe in terms of content, it's going to be easier to study for the GMAT Focus. And I kind of get into this more with this bullet. So as a result of the shorter GRE eliminating fewer content types, the shorter GRE covers a broader range of content than the GMAT Focus does. So the shorter GRE covers pretty much everything that's on the GMAT Focus, maybe in some slightly different formats, but pretty much everything that's on there, plus essay writing, plus geometry, and plus vocabulary, sentence structure, that jazz, right? All of the stuff on verbal is on the shorter GRE. All the stuff that's on quant is on the shorter GRE. And then data insights is mostly kind of funneled into that quant section. So shorter GRE means that you have to study for more things, which is maybe kind of a knock on that exam versus the GMAT Focus. Now, both tests, again, have weird question types. You're going to have to do exam-specific study for both tests. For the GMAT Focus, it's going to be for data insights. For the shorter GRE, it's going to be for quant, as well as for verbal. That's just the way it is. They're just kind of in different sections. So there really isn't a simpler test in terms of question types. They're both pretty complicated. But in terms of content, I would say for structure, maybe shorter GRE wins. I'd say for content, maybe GMAT Focus wins. And again, this is just my take. You got to give your own take. But these are the takeaways from what we've learned so far. All right, and again, reminder, I'm gonna hit all of these questions, and if I don't, I'll get back to them in the Q&A, so feel free to leave them in the chat in the meantime. Okay, so those were the key differences in the content. Let's talk key differences in the scoring. Okay, so GMAT Focus scoring, I'm just gonna pop up all of these bullets now so we can talk about them together. So data insights, all right, is scored from 60 to 90. Quant is scored from 60 to 90, and verbal is scored from 60 to 90. This is kind of interesting because on the current version of the GMAT, we have quant and verbal on essentially the same scale of scores, and then integrated reasoning and analytical writing being their own score, scored separately. We also saw that in the current version of the GMAT, only quant and verbal contribute to the total score from 200 to 800. On the GMAT Focus, one, we have a different scale for total score, 205 to 805, and all three of these sections contribute. Now, something that I want to note here, because we didn't know this for sure in my last GMAT Focus live stream, is that these sections are confirmed to be weighted equally. So quant, verbal, and data insights have equal weight in this total score. So, interesting things. We have more emphasis on data insight, right? Used to be IR was its own score, didn't contribute to the total. Now it, along with data sufficiency, is equally weighted. Pretty big deal. We also see that these scaled scores are different than the current version, right? The current GMAT used to be scored from 200 to 800, and all of those section scores were different. So there is a notable difference between the current GMAT scoring and the GMAT Focus scoring. So you cannot compare across the two. I'm going to talk more about why I think that is when we get into timeline in a second. But in the meantime, let's compare to the GRE, or the shorter GRE. So shorter GRE scoring is a different world. And if you're looking at that and going, wow, that sure looks familiar, it's because it is. This is exactly how the current GRE is scored. So we have analytical writing as the oddball, scored from 0 to 6. It's its own score. And then we have quant and verbal, each scored from 130 to 170. Now, the GRE has never reported a total score. It's just not a thing. But if there were a total score, it would be composed of quant and verbal, right? Analytical writing is, again, kind of sitting on its own. So we see that GMAT Focus has done something interesting in that it doesn't have those weird kind of secondary scores. It has 3 scores, all equally rated weighted all on the same scale, whereas on GRE, not the case. We also see for the GRE that our reported scores are the same, and ETS has in fact come out and said you should compare your current GRE scores and your shorter GRE scores. They're the same scale and schools can treat them the same. Whereas GMAT has come out and said, no, they're not the same between the current GMAT and the GMAT Focus. So what does that mean, right? How can you interpret that? Well, first thing that I didn't really say on the slideshow is don't compare your current GMAT scores and your GMAT Focus scores because they're not comparable, whereas maybe you can do that for the GRE. One other thing that I'll note here is that you can always compare percentile, all right, across exams. So you can always compare your percentile scores, but the raw scores, not so much. All right, on to what I actually wrote on the slide. So shorter GRE emphasizes data analysis less in scoring than GMAT Focus does. And this is kind of interesting because I would say the opposite was true of the, or is true of the current versions, right? In the current versions of the exam, data analysis is pretty much relegated to integrated reasoning, right, on the current GMAT, which again is its own little score. It doesn't contribute to the total at all. And so even though it's its own section, it's not a very important section. So it doesn't get as much weight, right? Whereas on the current version of the GRE, data analysis is part of quant. And so quant is half of that total score, even though there isn't a total score. It's weighted heavily in the quant score, right? Now on the new versions, that's not the case, right? So on the shorter GRE, data analysis continues to be part of the quant score. And we don't know exactly how the sections are going to be composed of content. That hasn't been revealed yet. But if it's anything like the current GRE, then if we're counting quantitative comparison as data analysis and the data interpretation sets, it's maybe half, probably a little bit less, right, of that quant score. Whereas, right, on the GMAT Focus, this new data insight section is a third of the total score. And it's in there, it's in the total score. So it's more heavily weighted. So that's kind of an interesting swap where data analysis is getting more weight, more credit, more of a role in the admissions process than on the shorter GRE. Also worth noting, the shorter GRE still has an essay, but it still doesn't really matter. So GMAT Focus just fully said, no, we're just getting rid of it. It's not a very important part of the test. It's maybe a check on plagiarism. It's maybe a way to demonstrate that you're meeting benchmarks, but it's just not that important and it's a burden on students, so it's gone. Whereas ETS has kind of more stuck to that line, said it is important, we are gonna keep it, we're gonna reduce it. But we're not going to add it to the total score. It's still going to be its own separate thing, which means that admissions committees still aren't going to weight it that heavily. So that's kind of an interesting thing here. You still have to do it for the shorter GRE, but it still doesn't matter that much. It's still not something you should prep a ton for. You should prep some, but not a ton. Also worth noting here, the shorter GRE has the same scale as the current edition of the GRE, whereas the GMAT Focus does not have the same scale as the current GMAT, which means you cannot compare except for using percentiles, right? Now, this is kind of an interesting one because this news is still pretty new, and so we're still seeing how schools are reacting to it. Now, one might think that the fact that the GRE is on the same scale might mean that it's going to be easier to accept for schools, right? Because we're going to be able to compare across all students regardless of what version of the exam they took. Is that true? Not 100% sure. I'm going to speculate a little bit more on this later as we get into timeline, but know at this point that we don't totally know what this means in terms of how schools are going to react to the new version of the GRE. We know how they're reacting to the new version of the GMAT. We'll talk about that shortly. All right, so those are the key differences in scoring. Now on to timeline. And this is pretty important, all right? So if you are making decisions, and a lot of folks I'm seeing in the chat are going, what should I choose? What should I do? This is relevant to you. So let's talk through the GMAT Focus timeline. So GMAT Focus practice tests are available now. This was not the case the last time that I did a live stream on the GMAT Focus. it is the case now. This was just released in the last week. So you can go to the MBA website and you can get free practice tests for the GMAT Focus. I believe you can also get paid ones. I'm not 100% sure, but you can practice the actual test right now for the GMAT Focus. And that I'd say is a pretty significant point in its favor, in that you can practice for this. You can see how you would actually score. You can get the feeling of taking it on test day. That said, you cannot register for the GMAT Focus quite yet. And again, I think that's maybe not a bad idea, because the fact that you have these practice tests available now means that you can take the current version, you can take the focus version, determine which one you're better at, again, not by comparing raw score, but by comparing percentile scores, and then register for the test that you are better at. So that's one advantage. But the registration opens on August 29th. Now, you cannot take the test on August 29th because the GMAT Focus is not going to be offered until Q4 2023. They haven't given us a date yet. And I'm assuming when registration opens on August 29th, we'll have a date. Maybe sooner we'll have a date, but we don't know for sure. So sometime in October, November, December, the GMAT Focus will become available for actual test dates, but we don't know yet, which is, again, kind of a knock against it. So practice test available now, yay. Don't know when we can take it, not so great. And then this is an interesting one. The current edition is no longer going to be offered starting in early 2024. So the current edition and the GMAT Focus are going to overlap, at least for a month, right? Maybe a few months. We don't know for sure, again, because we don't know these dates, but sometime in early 24, they're going to stop offering the current edition and you won't be able to take it anymore. But for a while, there's going to be an overlap. For a while, you're going to get a choice. I did see a question that I want to answer in the chat. That was, I have a current edition scheduled in the next month. Will it still be valid? Yes, your scores will still be valid for 5 years. So don't worry about that. And again, you do have an option to take one or the other for a while. But after early 2024, it will be gone and the GMAT Focus will be the one version. Okay, so that's the GMAT Focus timeline. Let's talk shorter GRE timeline. Okay. This one's kind of different because we don't have the same sequence of events that we do for GMAT Focus. So the first thing for the shorter GRE is that registration is open right now. You can choose a test date for the shorter GRE right now, which is interesting given that there are no practice tests for the shorter GRE available. So you would be signing up without knowing exactly what that is going to look or feel like. Interesting. I would say that that's something I would hesitate to do personally. I think if I were taking the GRE sometime soon, I would probably go for the current version because I can actually take a practice test for that right now. Whereas for the shorter GRE, I can't. And so that's kind of a risk, right? Now we know that there are going to be practice tests available sometime in September, but they haven't told us exactly when yet. So a little bit troubling, I would say. Now, this is also interesting because, again, we see a variation in the timeline. The current edition of the GRE will no longer be offered ever starting September 20th. So September 20th is the last date that you can take the current version of the GRE. And then immediately after, they're going to start offering the shorter GRE. So if you sign up for the GRE now, it will be for a test date September 22nd or after. So we see that there is no overlap between the current version of the GRE and the shorter GRE. And that, I think, kind of explains why they're doing what they're doing with the scoring, right? So for the GRE, they're saying the exam is changing, right? We are just fully transitioning from this version to the next one. There's no overlap, there's no choice, that's just the change, right? And so they're keeping the same scoring and they're moving really, really quickly because they're just going, this is the new version. Whereas the GMAT Focus, it's a slower roll, right? We're phasing them in, there's overlap. And so that's why I think they have those different scaled scores, is so that there is a difference between the current version and the GMAT Focus because you have a choice, all right? So interesting on the timeline, right? We have a different order of operations. You're going to be able to take the shorter GRE sooner, but you're able to prep for the GMAT Focus sooner. And you're going to be able to take the current version of the GMAT longer, whereas that's not the case for the shorter GRE. A mess. So what does this mean for you? All right, let's talk takeaways. The shorter GRE timeline is much, much faster than the GMAT Focus timeline, which is kind of bonkers given that, again, they just announced this last week, right? GMAT Focus has been announced for months at this point. So there's no overlap between editions. And for you, that probably means that there isn't as much of a choice between which version of the GRE you're going to take, right? It's probably going to be more a product of what's your timeline. If you're planning to take the test in August, great, you're taking the current version. If you're planning to take the test in October, great, you're taking the shorter version. It's only if you're like, oh, when in September should I take it, that maybe you have a choice. Not so much for the GMAT Focus. There's quite a bit more overlap. Additionally, there is going to be limited time with official practice tests before the test edition switches over. Now, this isn't the biggest deal in the world because, like I mentioned, the content is the same. There is no new content. For both versions of the test, you can use existing study materials and then just don't study the stuff that's been cut. So for GRE, just don't study the analyze and argument essay. For GMAT, just don't study sentence correction, don't study geometry, and don't study AWA. All of the rest you can study. However, there is an important element where you do need to practice with the test, right? Even if the content is the same, there is value to practicing with that structure, right? With exactly what the test is going to look and feel like on test day. And so on the GMAT Focus, you can do that now. And so there's more opportunity to prep. Whereas for the shorter GRE, if you're signed up for September 22nd, we don't know how long you're gonna have with official practice tests. You could have days with the official practice tests, or maybe weeks, but you don't know for sure is what I'm saying, right? You don't know if you're gonna do better or worse with the shorter version than on the current version. So that's the thing. It's a really efficient timeline for the shorter GRE. And I think that puts folks with earlier test dates at a disadvantage. And then again, you can register before taking an official practice test, which again, I would really, really hesitate to do because I just don't know how well I'm gonna do, right? Versus on the current version. So I might here choose the evil I know versus the evil I don't, right? So there I might choose the current version versus the shorter version because I know how I'm gonna perform, whereas I don't for the shorter version. So shorter GRE timeline is much faster than the GMAT Focus timeline. Okay, with all of that information, which test is right for you? What should you do? And again, I'm going to focus primarily on shorter GRE versus GMAT Focus, but also part of this decision is current GMAT and current GRE. We've got 4 test versions that essentially we're choosing between right now. Nasty. Okay, so which one's right for you? First, determine if you should actually take the current edition of either test. And I think this is really important because I see a lot of folks who are like, should I push my test date to later? How do I study for this new version? And I would just say, hey, hold up. Do you actually need to? Should you worry about these new versions, or should you just take one of the current versions? So there are a few things that you should consider here when you're thinking about should you take the current edition versus one of the new editions. First, consider your timeline. Can you wait months until you take your test, right? If you have upcoming deadlines, you may not be able to. For the shorter GRE, right? We know the first test date that's available is September 22nd, and we know that it's going to take 8 to 10 days for them to deliver the scores. So if you have a deadline that's in late September, early October, you cannot take the shorter version because they will not get your test scores on time, right? If you have a test date, you have application deadlines that are before the test is available, you can't take it. It just doesn't work. So if you're in that spot, don't even think about it. Now, if you're in the spot where you're going, well, I guess I could take, the GRE in early October, or, I think I can wait on the GMAT Focus. Again, I don't know exactly when, but maybe I can push to a later round. I don't know. Again, I'm just going to pause you right there and go, at this point, you probably have a pretty clear application timeline. You know when you're taking the test, you know when you're applying to schools, you know when you're working on your essays, you know when you're working on your resume or your CV, you know when you're bit, 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 bit. If you are throwing in this unknown, right, of a new test date, right, you're switching that up, and especially for GMAT Focus, you don't even know when that test date's going to be, that puts a huge wrench in your entire application process. When are you now doing your essays? When are you now doing your resume or CV? When are you studying, right? Are you going to have to study to maintain all the way until your test day? I don't know if I would choose that. So even if I was going, man, I'd sure like to take a shorter test, you want to consider the other factors, right? Can you wait months? Should you wait months? Or should you just, again, go with the devil you know, take the test now and be done and work on the rest of your application? I really wouldn't recommend, in particular, pushing back to a later round just to take this new version of the test. I just don't think it's worth it at this point. Again, it could be. I'll talk more about that in a minute if you're really, really unsure. But generally, again, consider your timeline. The other piece here, again, how are you going to approach your study, right? Especially when it comes to the shorter GRE. What materials are you going to use and when? Like I mentioned, with content, you can use whatever existing content for either test. You can use Magoosh for the shorter GRE. You can use Magoosh for the GMAT Focus. Again, the content is the same. Just don't study the stuff that isn't going to be on the test. But for practice tests, for GMAT Focus, we've got the official practice test. So you can practice with that. That's great. And test prep companies like Magoosh, we are rushing to get more official practice tests in our product with that new version. And we're hoping to do that very, very soon. For the shorter GRE, we cannot responsibly give you a practice test right now because we don't know what it looks like. That hasn't been revealed. And there aren't official practice tests until September. So if you're considering shorter GRE, can you study effectively? Right? So these are things, again, to consider. Another thing to consider, you're going to consider your test taking preferences. And I go much more into detail on this on my current edition versus focus edition GMAT live stream, as well as my shorter GRE versus current GRE live stream, when really breaking down the differences. But kind of the summary here is that the shorter versions are going to rely more on accuracy, whereas the current editions are going to rely more on stamina. So the current editions are long, right? They're really, really long. And so at the end of the test, you're probably tired, right? And you're maybe making mistakes more than you might on a shorter exam. So that's real. That can impact your score. However, right, with a shorter exam, you have less options to redeem yourself, right? A fluke, right? A question that maybe you shouldn't have missed, but you did, can have more of an impact than it would on a longer test, right? So not knowing an element of content on the GRE or missing a question on the GMAT Focus could have more of an impact than perhaps on the current version. So again, that's something to consider. There are other elements there as well for each exam. So for the GMAT, do you like geometry, right? If you do like geometry, maybe go with the current version. If you don't, maybe the Focus might be better for you. Same thing with sentence correction, right? Really not as much of a choice for GRE because there's so little difference between the content. It's really just that one essay. But for GMAT Focus, you'll want to consider the content elements as well. So consider your test taking preferences when choosing, again, current versus newer. And then the other thing that I want to mention here about the current editions is consider your schools. And I'm not seeing a lot of people thinking about this. So I really do want to raise this because these announcements are new and schools are still reacting to them. Now, the GMAT Focus announcement was a few months ago, which means that we've heard some stuff from some schools since then. And some schools, including Harvard Business School, have said, we're not taking the GMAT Focus for round 1 or round 2. And the reason for that is that students who are applying in round one will not be able to take it, whereas students who are applying in round two may be able to take it. And that means that there's just going to be too much difference in the applying set of students, right? So they've just said, nope, we're not doing it for round one or round two. We'll do it for the 2+2 cycle a little bit later, and we'll do it next year, but not this year, right? So if you're in a spot where you're applying to Harvard, you can't take the GMAT Focus. Don't do it. All right. So that's a thing. You want to look at your other schools as well, because again, they're still reacting and this news is still coming out. Now, the GRE news again just came out, right? This is a week old at this point. So schools haven't put out a ton of information yet. And ETS has advised schools to treat current and shorter GRE scores as comparable, but we don't know that they will. Right? It's possible that schools say, yep, cool, it's just the new version, fine, and they're totally chill with it. Or it's possible that, like Harvard Business School, they go, no, we're not just going to do it. We're not interested. And possibly it could cause schools to say, we're just not taking the GRE. We're done. We might just take the GMAT. We could even see, schools saying, we're not messing with this. We're going test blind. We're going test optional. We don't want to deal. Right? We could also see that schools have a preference for one version of the exam over the other, or that their preference between the exams changes. So consider your schools. You don't want to end up in a situation where you take a test or a test version that isn't going to be accepted. So get on the horn, call the admissions offices at each of the schools you're applying to and confirm what versions of the exams are they taking and do they have preferences. And then use that to inform. All right. So all of that other stuff about your timeline, about your preferences on test taking, that's all well and good. But this is the most important one. Consider your schools, because this could make or break your application. Okay. So first, figure out, should you even be worried about these new versions, or should you stick with the current editions? Okay. So if you're going, I'm good, right? My timeline's gold, my preferences, I would like a shorter version, and all of my schools are cool with the new versions of the test. So now you're in the spot of choosing between the shorter GRE and the GMAT Focus. What do? Once again, you're gonna consider your timeline, because the timelines for these two exams are different, right? So we don't know when the GMAT Focus is gonna be offered, right? So if you have deadlines in October, don't know if you're going to be able to take the GMAT Focus. If you have deadlines in November, don't know if you're going to be able to take the GMAT Focus. If you have deadlines in December, we don't know if you're going to be able to take the GMAT Focus. So if you are applying toward the end of this year, shorter GRE might be a better bet, because we just don't know for the GMAT Focus quite yet. Now this could change. They could announce it tomorrow, and then I withdraw this point. But at this juncture, we don't know. And that's troubling for application deadlines. So like I mentioned, 2023 application deadlines may be better suited to the shorter GRE or the current GMAT versus the GMAT Focus, because again, there's still so much unknown about timeline. Once again, you're going to consider your test taking preferences. So differences between the shorter GRE and the GMAT, there's quite a few, but kind of summed up what we talked about on the previous slides. The most important things, in my opinion, are that the shorter GRE is shorter, plus, and has a more standard time management, plus, but it's faster paced, negative, and has more content types to prep for, also negative. So we're gonna bear in mind who you are, right? Who are you? What do you want to deal with? Would you rather deal with something that's fast paced and has more to study for? Or would you rather deal with something that is longer and that your time management is going to be pretty funky, right? You're going to have to really fight perfectionism on. So it's really just going to depend on you. So consider your test taking preferences when you're choosing between the two. But most importantly, once again, you're gonna consider your schools, right? Just like schools are reacting to current versions versus new versions, they're once again reacting to GRE versus GMAT. So history, right? Business schools have been becoming more and more accepting of GRE scores, right? At this point, most schools will take both That didn't really used to be the case, but this could change that. We don't know at this point. So you're going to consider your schools when you're thinking GRE versus GMAT. So many schools already prefer one test over the other, and primarily many schools prefer the GMAT over the GRE. This may or may not continue. It could be exacerbated. We just don't know, right? Additionally, some schools may choose to accept only one of the tests for this application cycle or forever, right? We know Harvard Business School has said no to the GMAT Focus. This could be a thing for more schools. It could be the reverse for schools. Some schools could just say, we're getting out of the GRE game. We don't know, right? And then some schools could just move test optional or test blind. Again, this is a trend. This has been happening for some years. Some schools are going back on it. Some schools are moving from test optional, test blind back to test required. It's all unknown at this point, especially again with that Supreme Court decision looming. This could all change quite a bit in the coming years, right? Months even. So once again, you're going to want to call each of the schools that you're applying to, talk to a real human being and confirm, are you taking both tests? And is there one that you prefer? All right, so this can be the same call as the one that you're making for the current version versus the new version. So make sure, again, that you're making the right choice for the schools that you're applying to, as well as for yourself. All right, now let's say you did all of this, all right? And you're going, I still don't know. I'm still not confident. I can't make a decision. I know either one would work, but I just don't know which one is right for me. I maybe don't have a great handle on who I am as a test taker. If you're not sure, prove it out. Take a practice test for each exam when they're available. And again, this is not something that you can do right now because there aren't practice tests for the shorter GRE, and there won't be until September. But when they are available, you can take a practice test for each one. And again, you're not going to be able to compare the scores because the scales are different across the two exams, but you can compare the percentiles. And again, the percentiles represent where you are in the stack of other people taking these tests. And you're going to want to move forward with the one that you have a higher percentile score on. You can also do, you can compare to percentile scores for admitted students at your schools, and that can also be useful. So you're going to want to go ahead and move forward with the exam that you're better on. That's about it, right? And that's the move, right? So if you're not sure, choose the exam you're better at. Pretty straightforward. Now, it means taking a couple of practice tests, but that's all right. And in fact, I would recommend, if you can, doing this for all of the versions. Again, and that's assuming that your timeline allows you to take these versions. If your timeline doesn't allow or your schools don't allow, just don't think about them. But if you really are in a situation where you cannot decide, you can take a current GRE, a shorter GRE, a current GMAT, a GMAT Focus, and then use that to make your decision. Or if you've, for instance, taken the current GMAT already, or taken the current GRE already, or have a test date, and you're going, should I do a retake? You can take practice tests of the shorter GRE and the GMAT Focus. Compare your percentiles to the scores you already have. And if you did better, maybe a retake would be a good idea for you. So again, easier to do this with GMAT Focus because these practice tests currently exist. Not as easy to do for shorter GRE, but they will be available in September. So which test is right for you? Depends on a variety of factors. Don't discount the current edition. Don't discount your timeline. Don't discount how schools feel. And then at the end of it all, see which one you are better at. All right. That's our live stream. Now we're over time, but I'm going to stick around because this is a really important topic and I really want to answer your questions. So I'm going to take questions in the chat. I'm going to scroll back and see if there's anything I missed, but if you have more questions, something I didn't answer, add that sucker in the chat and I will respond. And then another reminder that again, we have a 20 to 25% off sale on Magoosh, GRE, and GMAT right now. Like I mentioned, all of the content applies to both the current versions and the new versions of the test. And we are rushing to get you practice tests for these new versions as soon as we can. In the meantime, you can take the official practice tests for GMAT Focus from the GMAT themselves. And then we're all waiting on ETS for official practice tests for the shorter GRE. But again, you can prep for all of those versions with Magoosh. Our 20 to 25% off sale ends June 12th. So in the meantime, take advantage. It's 20% off our test prep plans and 25% off our admissions and test prep bundles. Crazy deal. Really recommend it. All right, we're gonna go ahead and jump into Q&A. So I'm gonna scroll back up to the top and then work my way down. So we had this question earlier that I answered, but I'm gonna answer it again. Is the difficulty level higher now? In terms of the content that is retained is gonna be the same difficulty, right? So it's the same questions. So you can prep again with the same content you've already been prepping with. Reading comprehension, the same. Critical reasoning, the same. Quantitative comparison, the same. Data sufficiency, the same. It's all the same, right? Now, if you were really good at geometry, then maybe the new GMAT's going to feel harder because there isn't geometry. If you were really good at sentence correction, maybe the new GMAT verbal will feel harder because there is no sentence correction. There's also the difficulty of there's fewer questions, which means that flukes are going to play more into your score, right? If you just flub a question that you didn't mean to. So that could make it feel harder. Additionally, time per question was decreased on the GRE, time per question was not decreased on the GRE. It was a little bit different on the GMAT. I think it's a little faster on one of the sections, a little slower on the other section. And again, that could make the difficulty feel different than it previously did, but the content difficulty should be the same where the content is the same. Hopefully that makes sense. So again, it's just going to depend on you and your test taking style if the test feels harder or is harder to take for you personally. Okay. We got the question, did they change the GRE to shorter overall though? Sorry if this was already mentioned, no worries. So yes, it hasn't happened yet. It's happening in September, but yes, it's going to be a complete transition. They will not offer the current version anymore, and they will then offer the shorter version. So there's no overlap. It's not an option. It's just happening in September. So if you're taking September 20th or earlier, you're taking the current version. If you're taking September 22nd or later, you are taking the shorter version. I do not think there's any test dates for the 21st. If so, I have no idea what you're taking. But I just don't think there are any test dates on the 21st. Okay. Oh, this is a really good question. Do we get a research section for the new GRE? No, they cut it. So they cut the research/experimental section. And if you're not familiar with what that is, funny enough, I wasn't familiar with that when I went in to take my GRE. And so I freaked out when I got a third quant section. But essentially, they have either an experimental section, which is another quant or verbal section, or a research section where they ask you some questions about you, right? And that's on the current GRE. They have eliminated it for the new GRE, which just makes the test shorter, which is great. We don't know how they're going to test questions now, so that might mean that like one or two of every questions in each of the quant or verbal sections is research and or experimental and doesn't count toward the total score. I don't know. That's not revealed yet. Maybe they'll find a new way to test questions because they've got to do it. But yeah, so the research or experimental section is gone. Yeah, really good question. Answered this already. I have my regular GRE next month. Will it be valid? Yes. So the scores continue to be valid for years. But again, I would just check with your schools to see if they have a preference. So like valid and actually helpful to you, or maybe different things. So again, call your schools, but yes, it will still be valid. I would assume that there aren't going to be any schools that are like, no, we won't take old test scores, at least for this cycle. That would really, really surprise me. But still, I check it. Let's see. Okay, hi, will the GMAT Focus version replace the current version completely, or do we have the option to choose either the current GMAT or the GMAT Focus? I plan to write the GMAT by the end of the year. So it will eventually replace the current version completely, but there will be overlap where you get to choose, right? So you say you plan to write the GMAT by the end of the year. So we don't know exactly when the GMAT Focus is going to be released. So if you're taking it in, say, September, you'll take the current version. But October, November, December, unclear if it's just going to be the current version or if you'll have the option to pick between the two. We don't have that date quite yet. So again, I would recommend taking a practice test for the current version and a practice test for the focus version and seeing which one you do better on. Again, assuming that your deadlines are next year. If your deadlines are this year, honestly, I might not even mess around with the focus version just for fear of it not being available on time for your deadlines. But that's my take. And maybe that information will come out soon, but I wouldn't feel comfortable risking it. Question on scoring comparison. Great question. So like we mentioned, the current version of the GRE and the shorter version of the GRE should be comparable, whereas the GMAT Focus and the current GRE, not so much. In fact, I've looked a little bit at the scores, and it looks like it's going to be kind of a more brutal score on the GMAT Focus. It's going to be harder to get like that 700 score than it is now. Little stiffer competition at the top. So that's kind of interesting. And the way that I'm comparing this and the way that you should compare it is by looking at percentile scores. Now, please don't let this determine which test you take. I really have the fear that folks are going to be like, well, I want a score that starts with a 7, and that's going to be easier on the current GMAT, so I'm going to take that. Don't do that. Don't do that. That's not wise. Just go based on percentile. Percentile is the thing that matters to admissions committees more than raw score. So go based on percentile. Which GRE version should I choose? So many questions presented to you for you to answer. So I recommend going again through those questions that we went through in this live stream and asking them to yourself. I would also recommend check out the live stream that I just did last week. I have a series of questions for deciding between the current GRE and the shorter GRE. I really recommend going through that. Again, that's on our GRE YouTube channel. That'll just be helpful with making the right decision for you. When's the GMAT Focus starting? Don't know. I mean, we know it's going to be Q4 2023, so sometime between October and December, but that's not yet revealed. The latest that they'll reveal that is going to be August 29th, which is the date that registration opens. Could be sooner, but yeah, we don't totally know quite yet. Will the current version be discontinued? And clarification, is the current version of GMAT going to be discontinued? Yes, early next year. So after some overlap, we don't know exactly when quite yet. But if you really want to take the current version, I would recommend doing it this calendar year because they could discontinue it January 1st, but we don't know. Gonna prepare GMAT Focus. Cool. Awesome. Just make sure it works for your timeline and your schools. Okay. Since the GRE is shorter with lesser questions, does that mean the time per question average will be similar? How does it affect the overall time per question? Yeah, great question. Lot of question. So time per question on the GRE is shorter than on the GMAT. That is just true, right? It is consistent from the current version of the GRE. So time per question on the current GRE stays consistent for quant to quant on the shorter version and for verbal to verbal on the shorter version. It's the same, but it is shorter than the GMAT Focus. So yeah, that means that each question you have less time. Now, this is potentially balanced out by the fact that you can skip questions and come back to them. That's nice. And the fact that generally, I find that GRE questions are slightly less complex than GMAT questions. I find with GMAT questions, there's just like an extra trick, like an extra step that you can mess up than on a lot of GRE questions. But that's just my personal take. I find that GRE questions are a little more straightforward. Maybe there's one trick instead of two, or two tricks instead of three. So again, maybe justifies the shorter time per question. There's also, considerations for verbal that for verbal on GMAT Focus, you've got reading comprehension and critical reasoning, which take more time. Whereas on GRE verbal, you have reading comprehension and critical reasoning, but you also have text completion and sentence equivalence, which are maybe a little bit faster. So maybe that justifies the shorter time per question. Quant, maybe not so much. Before on quant, I found that it made sense that GMAT timing was longer because data sufficiency is like kind of a nasty question type compared to problem solving, in my opinion. But on the new version, data sufficiency is in a whole nother section where you get quite a bit of time per question, even more time per question. Whereas on the GRE, you have problem solving, but also a ton of other question types, which are more complex than problem solving, and you get less time per question. So like the content might be a little bit simpler, but there's more types of content and the question structure is more complex. So yeah, all of this to say, I think you're going to be maybe a little more pressed for time on GRE quant than on GMAT quant. Other sections, not as clear. Hopefully that's helpful. But again, if you're not sure for yourself, I would recommend trying it out and then seeing how you do, trying those questions and seeing how you do with it. Okay, I think that's it in terms of questions. If you have any more questions on this, since there's a lot to ask, this is a lot to consider. Again, I recommend checking out those other live streams. So the GMAT Focus versus the current version of the GMAT, I forget exactly what it's called, it's on our GMAT channel. The same one for the GRE is on the GRE channel. There's a lot more content in there. Really recommend breaking that down. I also recommend adding comments in the comment section on this video. We have folks who on our team who are experts who will come in and read those comments and answer those, and you can get your questions answered that way. But again, a reminder, you can prep for any version of the test with Magoosh. We're rushing to get you those practice tests as soon as we can, but in the meantime, you can prep all the same content with Magoosh. All right, thanks so much for being here. Please like this video if you enjoyed, leave your comments in the comments, and thanks for watching. Hope to see you soon.